it rules this forest. Come see the world with us. We offer great discounts on the Skarderska Krajina Trail. The tour includes excursions, picturesque attractions, forests, and lakes. We guarantee that you will be so amazed by this wondrous part of Eastern Europe that you'll want to stay here, or else we'll make you. Harry, his sister Melissa, my friend Mark, and I decided to visit the local tourist attraction, the Bulvich Whales. When we set off, everything had been as usual. We passed by the rocky plains, a small field, and then headed down a trail following the river. I called out to Mark, "Hey, how much longer until we reach the village?" "You see that forest up ahead? Once we're through it, we'll be at the village," Mark replied. The sun had set. We had to hurry up. We entered the forest and immediately felt cut off from the rest of the world. We were surrounded by ancient, sinister-looking trees that made the whole forest somehow seem ominous. But, as we discovered after a couple of hours, the trees weren't the strangest things we would encounter. Harry's compass, his map, and even his GPS all showed different routes of the forest. We were definitely lost now. We weren't going to reach the village today. The logical choice was to spend the night in the forest. We lit a fire and pitched our tents. The mood was terrible. I climbed into my sleeping bag and passed out in a couple of minutes. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy, wet footsteps and a strange rustling. I reached my hand out of the sleeping bag and felt water. Jumping up, I realized that there was a puddle around my sleeping bag. Strange. I remember putting my sleeping bag on a dry ground last night, and it hadn't rained at all since then. I climbed out of my tent and heard Mark's tent unzip next to me. Mark looked at me in bewilderment, holding up his soaked sleeping bag. Then suddenly, we heard a scream. Only then did I realize that Harry and Melissa weren't with us. We ran out of our tents into the darkness, and holy shit, I felt numb with horror at what we saw next. Melissa was stuck in a small marsh, wriggling around in an attempt to free herself. I came closer and saw that she was holding on to a pair of hands just barely sticking out of the black water. Melissa screamed in desperation, but she couldn't save Harry from being sucked down into the water. What was that? And how had we not noticed this dangerous area when setting up camp? I grabbed onto Melissa's arms and pulled her out of the marsh. We had to calm her down. A terrifying image stood before us. Two pale hands sticking out of the black water in the middle of a deep, silent forest. Suddenly the marsh gurgled. Harry's hands jerked, and with a disgusting chomping sound, disappeared under the water. It was as if something had pulled him down from deep within the marsh. I felt sick. I told Melissa that we should go back to the camp. I looked around and realized that Mark had disappeared. What was going on here? Then we heard Mark give a strangled cry. Melissa became hysterical, covering her head in her hands. I rushed off in the direction of Mark's voice, stumbling around in the darkness. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw something I would never forget. Mark was waist deep in another marsh. He was clinging onto the grass, trying to pull himself out, but something was pulling him down. I rushed towards him, grabbed both of his hands and tried to pull him up. Melissa appeared next to me. She grabbed onto him and tried to pull him up out of the marsh. We managed to pull him a little further out of the marsh when suddenly something forcefully pulled him back down. Mark yelled, the sound echoing throughout the forest. "No! It's eating me!" I turned pale. Melissa and I pulled harder. There was a crunch, and then we were thrown back. Mark was lying unconscious on the grass in front of us. We managed to pull him out of the marsh, but when I pointed my flashlight towards him, I almost threw up. Mark was missing the lower half of his body. It was still there, in the black water. I went numb with fear. Melissa was horrified. She couldn't even cry. Suddenly, the silence was interrupted by a gurgling sound. It was coming from the marsh, where Mark's legs had disappeared. In the light of the flashlight, we could see something rising out of the water. It was black, and it looked as if it was formed from some kind of thick slime. Its hands trailed on the ground as it moved towards us. An enormous head rested on its shoulders. The appearance of this nightmarish monster shocked me out of my stupor. I threw Mark over my shoulder and grabbed Melissa by the hand. We ran away, not waiting for the creature to fully emerge from the marsh. We left behind our tents and backpacks and rushed through the forest. Melissa and I were stumbling around and falling from exhaustion, just barely able to keep carrying Mark. He was just scarcely staying alive. The tree branches kept whipping us on the face. Melissa was crying and gasping. I was out of breath, and my head was spinning from running so fast. But we couldn't stop. We knew what waited for us if we did. We'd already lost any hope of getting out of the forest when suddenly the trees parted and the lights of a village became visible up ahead. Had we really made it? I called for help with a hoarse, ragged voice. An elderly woman ran out of the nearest house, coming towards us. A man appeared behind her, probably her son. He started to ask something, but I interrupted him. Please, help! He needs help! They brought us into the house without asking any questions. They laid Mark down right on the table, and the son of the elderly woman skillfully set to work. They led me and Melissa to the neighboring room. I tried to calm Melissa down, but I couldn't stop my own hands from shaking. After a few minutes, the woman brought us tea and a blanket. She was in the middle of asking what happened to us when her son called for her. I couldn't hear what they were discussing. They were speaking very quietly. I suddenly got a bad feeling. What were they hiding from us? Was it something to do with Mark? The man came back into the room. It's quite bad. He needs to see a doctor, urgently. There's a medical station not far from here. Was there no one in this village who could help Mark? That was alarming. But Melissa immediately stood up and grabbed my hand. Let's go. We need to hurry. At that moment, all I wanted was for Mark to survive. I took a look at him and suddenly felt that we'll never see each other again. That's ridiculous. Pushing aside my disturbing thoughts, I followed the man out of the house. We left the village and walked in the darkness along some sort of path that only the man could see. After a few minutes, the village lights disappeared behind us. We were back in the forest, and I was starting to feel scared. Is it much further? I asked the man. It's close. There's a road past that hill. Then we'll be just a stone's throw away from the station, he replied without turning around. What kind of station is this? Just then it struck me that we were following a stranger to a place that only he knew how to get to. Sensing our nervousness, the man started to tell us about a geological survey that had been conducted in the area a few years ago. Many underground springs had been discovered around the forest. Many people had worked at the research station. They'd been drilling wells into the ground, and one day, they found something ancient and unknown. Then people from the station and surrounding areas started to disappear. Half of the village went into the forest and never returned. So the station was shut down, and now there's just a small group of people working there, some of which are doctors. We'd been so distracted by his story that we didn't realize that we'd entered a large clearing. There weren't any roads in sight. I want to show you something. Come on, said the man, and led us towards a cluster of small stone structures. As we walked closer, I realized that they were wells. There were at least a dozen of them in the clearing. Why were there so many? This is where they did their test drilling. Take a look. He beckoned to us. Melissa and I walked towards warily. Why is he showing us this place? What was I supposed to be looking at? Don't do it, Melissa whispered to me fearfully, but I looked into the well anyway. All I could see was a bottomless abyss. A rotten smell was coming from the inside, and I could hear a faint murmur. I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, someone hit me on the back. I lost my balance, stumbled over the edge of the well, and fell into the abyss. My heart stopped. After a few seconds, I fell onto something soft and sticky. I heard Melissa screaming from somewhere above. Then I heard a thud, and the scream stopped. A stranger's life instead of one of ours. The man's voice echoed in the well, and everything fell silent. I could see the moon hanging high above me. I couldn't hear anything else. I knew it was useless to look for Melissa or save Mark. The villagers clearly knew everything. They never intended to help us. They just wanted to use us as sacrifices. Suddenly, I heard that gurgling sound again. The mud shifted. A black silhouette slowly rose from the far corner of the grotto. I knew that this was the end. I had nowhere to run. It moved towards me. I could hear its dull steps. No, not like this. I backed away. I thought of Harry, of Mark. I don't want to die like them. The creature, the ruler of the forest, came closer. My foot stumbled and I fell into the water. I got caught in the current and was rapidly led towards a cluster of rocks. I'd much rather die like this than be eaten by that creature. But I was saved at the last moment. The current dragged me under the rocks and I ended up in an underground channel. The water was leading me somewhere. My head hit against the rocks a couple of times, and I could feel myself running out of air. I started to choke. My hands convulsively grabbed at the water. I was just about to fall unconscious when I was suddenly thrown to the surface. I paddled my hands with the last of my strength, and soon felt the ground beneath my feet. I crawled to the shore of a small lake in the forest and fell onto my back. Did I really make it out? I'm alive? I breathed with difficulty, when suddenly, I heard the same disgusting gurgling sound. My heart was pounding wildly in my chest. I jumped up and ran away. I ran with every last of my strength, not knowing where I was headed. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. I was about to faint when I reached a road. Impossible. A car drove towards me. I waved my hands calling for help. I was starting to doze off in the back seat when I thought about how lucky I'd been to escape. I managed to get out alive, but the others, I didn't want to think about them. I don't remember how I got back to the hotel. I had to do something, call the police, contact the embassy, or get the hell out of there. My thoughts were a mess. First, I decided to wash out the dirt that had dried onto my skin. I stank. I ran the tap to fill up the bathtub. While I undressed, I thought of my friends. What had happened to them was beyond terrifying. I just hoped that they hadn't suffered too much. Suddenly, I was hit by an uncanny smell of the forest marsh. Impossible! A chill ran down my spine. I slowly opened the door and saw a black, sticky sludge flowing over the rim of the bathtub. I was horrified. I couldn't move a muscle and just stood there, watching as an enormous black figure rose out of the tub.
Stop,
Said a voice in my head. I hadn't thought that. The creature was speaking in my head.
Do you want to live? Let's make a deal. Food in exchange for your life.
Food, I whispered through dry lips.
A sacrifice. An outsider. You'll have to bring them here.
I was shaking. I couldn't move. All I could do was lick my dry lips and agree.